He is standing in a doorway that no longer belongs to him. The great hall behind him has been ransacked, the trestle tables overturned, the wall hangings torn, the iron chandelier pulled from its chain and left to rust in the rushes. Beneath his boot, half buried in mud and ash, lies a wax seal. Not his enemy's seal, his lord's. The man whose protection he paid for with 3 villages, with grain, with labor, with 23 years of bending the knee. The seal is broken. He crushed it himself. He is not entirely sure when. He clutches a ledger of rent rolls, figures that once represented power, obligation, the geometry of the world as God intended it. The ink is smeared with ash. Something darker at the corner. He doesn't look at that corner. Behind him, the fields stretch empty under a gray February sky. The peasants are gone. Not fled. Not all of them. Some. His name was Renaud de Montferrat, a minor lord, vassal to the Count of Burgundy, overseer of 3 villages near Autun in central France in the year 1358. He was 44 years old and had never, in his entire life, questioned whether the system he served would outlast him. Lords did not question feudalism because there was nothing to question. It was not a policy or a choice. It was the ground beneath their feet. You do not interrogate the ground. And the numbers suggest why. At its absolute peak, roughly 1000 to 1250 AD, feudalism bound an estimated 90% of Europe's population in some form of legal servitude or obligation. 90%. Lords and their vassals controlled approximately 70% of all arable land across Western Europe. Not rented, controlled. The distinction matters enormously. A serf, a villein in the language of the time, could not marry without his lord's permission, could not move to another village, could not pass land to his children without paying a death tax called a heriot, which often meant surrendering his best ox, the very animal his family needed to survive the following spring. Look at the pyramid. At the top, a king, commanding fealty from perhaps a few dozen powerful nobles. Below them, hundreds of lesser lords.
After today, we won't follow him anymore, but we'll follow what he represents, a system, and its slow, inevitable unraveling. What actually happened here is stranger and more interesting than a story about the powerful grinding down the weak. There are no clean villains. There is no single moment of rupture. There is just a system, slowly becoming impossible to sustain. Feudalism was not invented by tyrants. It was invented by survivors. It emerged from the wreckage of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known, as a desperate, pragmatic answer to a single, terrifying question. When the roads stop being safe, when the armies stop coming, when the law stops being enforced, how do you keep people alive? For 2 centuries, feudalism answered that question brilliantly. And then it planted the seeds of its own destruction so thoroughly, so systematically, that by the time the peasants of England marched on London in June of 1381, the entire structure was already hollow. The walls were still standing. The titles were still being used. The ceremonies were still being performed. But the thing that made feudalism real, the mutual obligation, the reciprocal loyalty, the belief that the pyramid served everyone inside it, that was already dead. What killed it was not one thing. It was 3 things, arriving in sequence, each one exploiting a crack that was already there from the very beginning. We are going to trace each crack. We are going to watch each one widen. And at the end, we are going to ask a question that will be uncomfortably familiar. Because the feudal contract did not disappear.
To understand why feudalism broke, you have to understand what it replaced. And what it replaced was silence. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was effectively finished. The last emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, the name itself a cruel joke, two great founders compressed into one powerless boy, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer on September 4th of that year. No great battle. No dramatic last stand. Just a document, a demotion, and a pension in Campania. What followed was not darkness in the dramatic sense.
It was theological. To defy your Lord was, in a very real sense articulated by the clergy, to defy God's order. That theological reinforcement was the system's greatest innovation, and its most dangerous one. Here is the first crack, baked in from the very beginning. Feudalism ran on personal loyalty, not institutional loyalty, not loyalty to a flag or a constitution or an abstract idea. Loyalty to a specific person. Charlemagne died in January 814, and the empire he had spent a lifetime building did not survive him by much. By 843, his grandsons had carved it into 3 pieces at the Treaty of Verdun, not out of malice, but because that was simply how inheritance worked. And with that carving, the center stopped holding. Each division created new lords with new loyalties. Each new lord created new sublords. The pyramid didn't just grow.
The investiture controversy, the decades-long conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV that exploded in 1076, was not a theological dispute. It was a war over who ultimately owned the loyalty of every bishop, every abbot, every monastery in Europe. In January 1077, Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle of Canossa for 3 days, begging the Pope's forgiveness to avoid excommunication. The most powerful secular ruler in Europe. Barefoot. In the snow. For 3 days. The message was not lost on his vassals. If even a king could be made to kneel, not in battle, not by force of arms, but by the withdrawal of spiritual... By the summer of 1350, the Black Death had killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. That range, 30 to 60%, should stop you cold. Historians argue about the precise figure because the scale of the dying made accurate record-keeping nearly impossible. In some regions of France, England, and Italy, the mortality rate exceeded 70%. Entire villages were not depopulated. They were erased. Florence went from a population of roughly 95,000 in 1338 to somewhere around 45,000 by 1351. England lost an estimated 40% of its population. In certain rural areas of Languedoc, tax records from the 1340s list villages that simply do not appear in records from the 1360s. Not reduced, absent. Now think about what that actually meant. Feudalism ran on bodies, peasant bodies specifically. Hands in the field, backs under load, labor rendered in exchange for the Lord's protection. Take away a third of those bodies, and the math stops working. Feudalism ran on serfs. Serfs worked the land. The land fed the Lord. The Lord funded knights. The knights protected the system. Remove the serfs, or more precisely, remove half of them, and every step of that chain begins to buckle. But here is the paradox that no lord anticipated. The Black Death did not weaken the peasantry. It empowered them. When half the agricultural
In other words, the Lord's answer to the greatest labor shortage in European history was to make labor more controlled, not less. This is the moment where feudalism's fatal logic becomes undeniable. Every time the system was threatened, its instinct was to tighten.
In thousands of small transactions, across decades, as the economy beneath the pyramid quietly restructured itself around a medium that lords could neither grant nor revoke. The third accelerant had been building since 1095. The Crusades are often taught as religious wars. They were also the most catastrophic financial event in European noble history before the Black Death. To fund a crusade, a lord needed liquid capital. He needed it fast and in large amounts. His wealth was in land. So he sold rights, granted exemptions, borrowed from merchants and Jewish moneylenders at punishing interest rates, and sometimes sold the land itself. The First Crusade alone, launched in August 1096, required the mobilization of somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people, and every one of those people needed to be equipped, fed, and transported across thousands of miles. By the time of the Seventh Crusade, which Louis IX of France launched in 1248, French noble families had been mortgaging their futures for 150 years. Some never recovered. The estates that returned from the Levant came back not.
And in June of 1381, the peasants of Kent and Essex, furious over a poll tax of 4 pence per head, levied for the third time in 4 years, marched on London. They did not sneak. They did not hide. An estimated 60,000 people marched openly on the capital of England. They burned the Savoy Palace, the residence of John of Gaunt, the most powerful lord in England. They opened the prisons. They executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord High Treasurer. And on June 14th, 1381, their leader, a man named Wat Tyler, a former soldier from Kent, stood face to face with the 14-year-old King Richard II at Smithfield and made demands that would have dissolved the legal basis of serfdom entirely. Free all serfs. Abolish all feudal services. Fix rents at 4 pence per acre. Pardon all rebels. The king, 14 years old, agreed to everything. Within the hour, Wat Tyler was dead, stabbed by the mayor of London, William Walworth, during an altercation whose exact cause remains disputed. The rebel army, leaderless, was dispersed. The promises Richard made were revoked within weeks. The leaders of the revolt were hunted and executed.
England was not alone. France had already seen it coming. In May of 1358, the same year Renaud de Montferrat stood in his broken doorway, the peasants of the Beauvaisis region north of Paris rose without warning or apparent organization and began killing nobles. Not raiding, not demanding, killing. The Jacquerie lasted approximately 3 weeks. In that time, peasant bands attacked somewhere between 150 and 200 noble estates. The chronicler Jean Froissart, writing with undisguised aristocratic horror, described atrocities on both sides with a specificity that suggests genuine trauma in his sources. The nobles suppressed it with overwhelming force. Thousands of peasants were killed. The leaders were executed with elaborate cruelty. The official lesson the nobility drew from the Jacquerie was, never let it happen again. The practical lesson, that their peasants were capable of organized, lethal resistance, was one they could not unlearn. In Bohemia, beginning in 1419, the Hussite Wars demonstrated something even more unsettling.
Jan Hus, a theologian executed by the Council of Constance in July 1415 for heresy, had argued that the Church's authority was not absolute, that Scripture, not papal decree, was the final authority. His followers took that argument about spiritual hierarchy and applied it to every other hierarchy they lived under. The Hussite armies, led by Jan Žižka, a one-eyed general who had lost his remaining eye during the siege of Robbie in 1421 and continued commanding by memory and tactical instinct, defeated 5 papal crusades between 1420 and 1431. Peasants, using wagon forts and early gunpowder weapons, repeatedly destroyed the armored knights who were supposed to be feudalism's enforcement mechanism. The knight, the entire military rationale for the feudal bargain, was becoming obsolete. Not metaphorically, literally. A crossbow bolt fired by a peasant with 3 weeks of training could kill a knight with 30 years of expensive martial education. The English longbowmen had demonstrated this at Crécy in 1346. Žižka demonstrated it again and again and again. When the military rationale for feudalism collapsed, what remained was habit and inertia.
And those, history repeatedly shows, are not enough. Now, step back from the 14th century. Step all the way forward. Here is where it gets uncomfortably familiar. In 2023, an estimated 57.3 million workers in the United States, roughly 36% of the entire American workforce, were part of the gig economy. No land, no guaranteed wage. No lord, technically, but the gig worker pays a commission rate set unilaterally by the platform, which can change without negotiation. In 2022, Uber's commission rate to drivers in some markets reached 35% of each fare. The drivers own their own vehicles, pay their own fuel, carry their own insurance. They bear the costs of production. The platform extracts the surplus. The feudal lord did not build the serf's cottage. He did not plant the serf's fields. He collected rent on land the serf made productive with his own body. The parallel is not perfect. It never is. But it is close enough to be uncomfortable. And here is where it gets genuinely important. The thing that made feudalism collapse was not the Black Death alone. It was not the merchant class alone. It was not the revolts alone. It was the question of what the base receives in exchange for what it produces. The lords of 14th century Europe believed their pyramid was permanent because it had always been there, because it had divine authority, because it had legal force, because challenging it seemed not just dangerous, but cosmically wrong. And then half the population died, and the survivors discovered they had options. Every system that decides the answer to instability is more control rather than more adaptation is writing the same ending for itself. The Statute of Laborers failed not because it was poorly enforced. It failed because it was attempting to legislate a reality that no longer existed.
So, back to Smithfield. June 14th, 1381. Wat Tyler is dead on the ground. The rebel army is watching. The 14-year-old king rides toward them alone and tells them, in a moment of either extraordinary courage or extraordinary political instinct, that he will be their leader now, that they should follow him to the fields outside the city, where they will receive everything they came for. They followed him. They dispersed.
If you made it this far, you already know this channel does not do easy answers. We do the real ones. But here is the thing about endings. Something always moves into the space they leave behind. The nation-state, the merchant republic, the early capitalist order, each one stranger and more consequential than the last. That story is coming. Make sure you are there for it. And those stories have their own cracks, their own accelerants, their own Wat Tylers waiting in the wings. Subscribe to Empires in Echoes if you want to follow the whole arc. Every empire, every collapse, every lesson that the people in power never learned in time. Hit the bell. Leave a comment with one modern institution you think is running on habit and inertia rather than genuine function. We read them. And sometimes they become the